Welcome to another How to Succeed podcast, the show that helps you get to the top and stay there. This is How to Succeed at Measuring and Managing Productivity. The podcast is brought to you by Sandler Systems, LLC, and protected by U.S. copyright laws. Sandler is the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training with over 200 locations. You can find more information at sandler.com or subscribe to this podcast wherever you happen to be listening to it right now. I'm your host, Mike Montague, Director of Community Engagement at Sandler, and my guest this week is Brian Jackson, a longtime Sandler trainer from San Diego. And we're going to talk with him about how to succeed at measuring and managing productivity. Brian, welcome back to the podcast. Tell me a little bit about productivity here and what we're talking about today.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike. It is good to be back. So productivity, the main question is this: what constitutes productivity? When I put this question out to the participants of my program, right, a Zoom room of 20 people, it's always surprising to me that when I ask this question, what exactly do you need to do every day in terms of behaviors in order to be successful? How many behaviors, right? And like what constitutes productive day? How do you know at the end of the day, when you put your head down on the pillow, that you did everything today you were supposed to do? And when I put that question to a group of salespeople, I'm always surprised that 95% of them can't answer that question. They have a general idea. I need to make cold calls. I need to follow up with current clients or prospects, but they can't assign a very specific number to very specific behaviors. Isn't that kind of interesting, Mike? That given the fact that they're commission driven, that you would think that's something that most salespeople will be able to answer.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic because I've struggled with this in my career a little bit of different types of goals and measurements. I think sometimes measuring the wrong thing, like your commissions, are worried about, lagging indicators can throw you off. Sometimes having like small behaviors that you're measuring without the big directional compass of like, are you going to be happy if you hit these goals, can mess this up. And then everything kind of in between. Sometimes I like a small bar so that I can kind of feel like I'm successful, know I'm going to hit my bills, but I'm going to try and focus on some big elephant swings, where I can go and maybe try and land a huge deal. Or other times where I don't want to pursue that at all, and I really just need to make sure that we're surviving or getting through a rough patch, like a change in an economic condition or something else, where you really got to get back to these measurements that you're talking about here today. And am I just getting through the behaviors to make sure that I'm surviving through a summer slump or through an economic downturn or the pandemic that we had, right? That's where I see a lot of this coming in.
Yeah, and there's certainly a lot of intuition when it comes to business planning, but at the end of the day, it shouldn't be about intuition. It should be about math. And what happens is when people don't have answers to those questions, when they can't list out what are the very specific, measurable, attainable behavioral goals that I need to do every day, what that really impacts is the energy transfer that they have, not just in their sales calls, but even throughout their entire lives. They feel lost, really. They feel busy. Imagine being lost in a thick wooded forest. It takes effort with every step you make, with every bush you try to climb over or through, and yet you don't know if you're even headed in the right direction. That's the way a lot of salespeople feel, consciously or subconsciously, right? So again, it starts out with just knowing, am I headed north, right? What are the behaviors that typically lead to success with other people that do a similar role to what I have, right? Consulting with other peers that have been successful, consulting with your leadership. What are the various prospecting activities that would lead me to success? I think we got that one pretty much down, but that still is like navigating with a compass, like you mentioned earlier, right? It's just telling you, okay, I'm headed north. But what we really ought to have, and this is what the value of CRMs is. When CRMs first came out, and I can remember, it's why I'm starting to feel old. But when they first came out, they felt like the worst micromanagement tool ever invented, and people generally hated them. But the way that CRMs should be is they should equip salespeople with the tools to really measure and manage their prospecting behaviors to determine, am I tracking towards my goals, so that they can feel like they're navigating with a GPS and not a compass. If they can check in with that CRM dashboard on a regular basis and quantify that the behaviors that I'm doing, that I'm consistent with, are tracking me towards my goals, then that gives them a sense of relief, a sense of peace. That when you take that sense of peace into your sales calls, you're better able to stay third party, not get emotionally involved, which you know how important that is. To anybody who understands the Sandler methodology knows how important it is to stay emotionally third party during sales calls. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. A couple of things came to mind. Jocko Willink says discipline equals freedom, but in our world, a full pipeline equals freedom. So, you
Yeah,
make better decisions and you have a better life as a salesperson when you got a full data and CRM and you know what you're supposed to do next or who you're supposed to call next. It makes your life a lot easier. And then I wanted to ask you one more thing here in attitude before we move on, which is the management part of this. So we also today wanted to talk about management. And speaking of which, if you're a leader and you don't have a good CRM, ask your Sandler trainer about HubSpot, and we'll get you set up or introduced to one, at least get you started. But for the managers, I think that is sometimes a hole as well, that if you don't know what a good rep does on a day-to-day basis or the number of calls that it takes in order to make a sale, that can really throw off a lot of your management productivity, but also the productivity of your team. You have to coach and you have to be able to address things before they happen. So if you're only looking at sales results, you can't manage that way. That's managing 90
right.
days ago or in the rearview mirror, and that doesn't work. So can you talk a little bit about what all this means as a manager?
Oh, yeah, yeah, it's very important. So, with leadership, regardless if you're talking about sales or anything, it's all about guiding somebody through their developmental path to the point that you can eventually delegate to them. That's what leadership is all about. It's about sort of changing the amount to which you give direction and support based on people's development in a very specific task. And again, you want to get them to the point that you can delegate and trust them to make decisions and execute them entirely. But along that path, to get them there, the process of sort of letting go and releasing control of a leader, it's counterintuitive, because we as leaders are compensated to succeed. So we can't necessarily allow our team, nor can we afford our team to fail, even though we know in Sandler that we learn from failure. So what we have to do as leaders is, let's say we're trying to lead a team to go from A to Z. We have to create checkpoints, A to B, B to C, et cetera. And you can allow somebody to fail in reaching from A to B, but you can't let them fail in reaching from A to Z on time. Does that make sense? Right.
Right.
So that's where, if we bake this into these metrics, the behaviors that we know should, based on the math, lead us to success, and we create benchmarks along the way where we can check in every 30 or 60 or 90 days or 180 days. It gives us the ability as leaders to go, whoa, hold on a second. We're not quite where we need to be. We're 75% to plan. Let's eliminate this thing over here that's not working, and let's double down on this thing over here that is working, and we can still reach our goals. You can make what I like to say is data-driven decisions based off the information that you have. And that's how you can use that sort of mentality as a leader.
Yeah, and I think that takes us right to behavior. Now, this one is one of those topics where we're talking about behavior, so we're going to get a little bit meta here. And I think there's two things that we need to talk about. First is the goals, plans, and actions of putting together a behavioral plan, and then maybe we'll dive deeper into what those actual behaviors are that you're measuring and stuff. So tell us about what we need to do and plan for in order to make sure that we have the behavior intact, or that we're measuring.
Well, it starts with something in Sandler that we call cookbooking. Okay, we don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail on that, but the gist of it is that you do need to start. You made a slight reference to this. I picked up on it earlier. that you need to know what your personal goals are. You need to have your why figured out in your life. That's on a really high level. And then you need to equate your business goals to your personal goals to get that, rental property that you want to buy. What percentage overquoted do you need to finish? And then you need to work that math backwards to determine how many new clients you need to have based on the complexity of your sales role. That can be really difficult to do the math if you need a combination of, like you referenced earlier, whales versus marlins versus tuna, the different sizes of the deals. You might have to work 3 different sort of categories in terms of behaviors and then add them all up at the end. But what you're trying to figure out is how many proposals it takes to get those clients, how many prospects it takes to get those proposals, how many conversations it takes to get those prospects, and ultimately how many behaviors it takes to get those conversations, right? And once you've made it to the end and you know how many behaviors you need to do, and this is where the rubber meets the road. At that point, it's all about calendar blocking. And I believe you've got to block time to block time. You actually have to block time on Friday afternoons, about an hour from 12.
I said it was going to get meta, right?
Yeah. And you got to block time on Friday afternoons to block your week ahead, and make sure that if you've got to do 20 phone calls that generally takes an hour every day, well, then you're going to move that time block to the earliest possible time of the day to eat that frog and get it over with and be consistent and disciplined. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's really setting up that process. I think if you're a manager, you got to even help your team do it, because sometimes they're too caught up in the day-to-day of keeping their job and making their sales that they're not taking the time to step back and do that goal setting process, decide where they want to be, how much money they want to make, how many calls it would take to make that amount of money and number of sales. And you need to coach them to align that to the departmental goals. And so if you take their individual sales of what they're going to do, you add those up to your department and higher up, you're adding that up to company goals. And I think it's really a part that people miss, is stringing that string all the way from, like you said, from A to Z, that it's from the company goals and where we want to be in the marketplace and the competition and all that stuff tied all the way down to the individual rep, how many calls and actions they need to take per day.
Just a few points on that, Mike. One, shameless plug. This is where having a third-party person like a Sandler coach is nice, because to allow us to do that exercise with your team instead of you makes it feel a lot less like micromanagement. The other thing is that this is also a great opportunity to let the team build rapport with each other by doing this exercise together and helping each other in terms of their brainstorming, creativity, and best practices. And then third and finally, again, staying away from that sense of micromanagement and knowing that everybody has different disc personalities and different skill sets and experiences. Let your team present to you how they're going to get from A to Z. You might be surprised that somebody has a different way of doing things that's equally as effective. But then again, it goes back to having checkpoints. You can't just wait till they get to Z and then say, well, you're too late. You can check from A to B, B to C, and say, so how are we doing? And at those points, if they're failing, if their plan is not working, it gives you more of a right to speak up as a leader, to make suggestions and to help them. Does that make sense?
Now, I wanted to ask you a really tough one here about behavior too, because we've already talked a lot and hinted around what we're measuring and how we're doing it. But I found that there is this interesting dynamic that happens, like you said, with the micromanaging, that we don't need to maybe track every day or every call for a salesperson or ourselves, because that can stress you out. And we even mentioned before we hit record that I'm having one of those days where it's cloudy outside. I'm struggling. I just don't have it. And I'm trying to do the minimum behaviors that I need to do to make it through today and then succeed a little bit better. And I think, getting up and making the calls sometimes is a great deal. Or if I got to make 10 dials, let's just make 10 and then let's go hit the beach because you're in San Diego. That is a different way of behaving, I think, than people that try to manage every minute of their calendar, and they're all about time management and productivity. And if you're trying to cram stuff in, I think we lose the ups and downs of being human, but also the ups and downs of being in sales. We know that we're not going to win them all, We're not going to win 1 out of 5 every time. We're going to have streaks, and we're going to have slumps, just like baseball players. And how do we manage that as we go throughout our day or our behavioral plan?
Well, I read a meme recently. It was some fitness person said, people ask me how I stay so, fit, right? Or how I stay so enthusiastic about working out. I think that's what they said. And the person responded, I don't. I stay consistent. Right. And so that was this person is a very fit person. So it was interesting to see her say, I don't stay passionate. I stay consistent. So the same is true for selling. What we do determines how we feel. What we do determines how we feel. If you've done the math and you know that your income depends upon this consistency, when you choose, when those saboteurs, those voices in your head that sabotage you and convince you to stay in bed or convince you to put something off, when they start to speak up, you can then say, hey, hold on a second. I ain't giving myself a pay cut here. Okay. I know that if I miss that hour of dials, I'm basically giving myself a pay cut because those dials are worth money to me. That's what you'll know, having done the math, having done the math to know that you've got to be consistent with X number of dials and to make a certain amount of money. You can't remove that calendar block without knowing that you're giving yourself a pay cut. So that's where now you can't also afford yourself the privilege, maybe the treat of skipping every once in a while if you're tracking ahead of your goals, right? That's totally fine. It's one of the best things about sales. You can manage your own self, right? But
yeah, I love what you said though about moving that calendar block and not skipping it, because that's what I've kind of found for me is if I just don't have it today, I'm in a bit of a slump, I can move these calls to Thursday. But what I can't do is skip that call. I can't let that one fly by because that's going to give me the pay cut. I think that really clears it up for me. And sometimes it is moving stuff forward. If I want to give myself Friday afternoon off, let me move those calendar blocks up to earlier in the week and take advantage of when I am on a streak and I'm feeling good and I've sold 3 in a row. That's not the time to stop either,
Well, here's what I meant by that. Not to contradict, because I agree with what you're saying too, but what I meant by moving calendar blocks is that I block every day a behavior. If I know I got to do it Monday through Friday, I'll put that calendar block in at let's say 6 o'clock in the morning. And then on a Friday afternoon, when I block time to block time, I will move that calendar block as I'm planning my week to the earliest possible time of each day that I'm available to get it over with as soon as possible on each of those days. And then I'll freeze it in my calendar. I'll mark it as busy and I won't allow anything to book over it. Sometimes you have to move calendar blocks, and I agree with some of the things you were saying, but ultimately it's good to get the stuff done as soon as possible every day. Just so, Mike, a lot of people ask us, when's the best time to make phone calls? You know what? I don't put any science or anything behind that. I say, just get them done as soon as you can. Right.
The best time to make calls is now or yesterday. Have already done them, so get them out of the way. Right. Yeah. I love that, and I think that takes us to technique. We've already hinted at a few of these as well, but what comes to mind when you think about techniques for measuring and managing productivity?
The biggest thing when it comes to technique, and that's a really good question, is simplicity. Really, just keeping it simple. With measuring productivity, there needs to be a combination of quantity behaviors, quantity metrics, like number of dials, number of meetings set from meetings, or number of referrals asked and number of referrals received. But then there needs to be a quality metric where you measure one against the other. So for every referral asked, how many do I actually receive? For every meeting I book, how many next meetings or results do I get? And how many appointments do I get from calls? The quantity metrics keep us honest on our behaviors, but the quality metrics help with leadership and your Sandler coach knowing what might we need to lean into and increase our effectiveness with in terms of our techniques. Does that make sense?
I think that's great. And you triggered something for me that I think goes back to what we were just talking about with the calendar, that it's one of these things that we got to decide as a leader or for ourselves as an individual, what is not customizable, negotiable, or movable. And then we have to decide what is can be personalized and adapted to each individual. And I think that's a really important question, because as you were talking there and we were thinking about the calendars again, is a blank sheet of paper works really well as a CRM if you're an individual rep and that's what works for you and helps you do the behaviors. But a customized CRM probably works better for an enterprise organization that has 1,000 sales reps and needs to track behaviors. And I think once you realize sort of what needs to be, some people on your team are going to need calls. They're going to need a personal touch or a thank you or somebody to hold them accountable. Other people are going to be cranking and they need you to tell them when to stop or when to change their behaviors because they're doing them. They need to do them differently. And I'm not doing a great job of phrasing the question today, but what I'm thinking is like a CRM, if we have one as a team, we need everybody to use that. That's non-optional behavior. We need the data in there to make informed decisions like we talked about earlier. But how people go about their business, making their calls, we need some flexibility for their personality styles, for what kind of coaching they need, where they are in their career, whether they're new or experienced, what markets they're in. There are some things that need to change behaviorally. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what some of those are?
Well, kind of going a little deeper into what you were saying, something you mentioned earlier, I think that CRMs have become much more customizable based on the fact that individual reps often do need their own very specific dashboards. I do think that HubSpot is leaps and bounds, head and shoulder above the competition in terms of their flexibility and customization ability for that purpose. And so anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think where I'm getting at is when we're looking at this behavioral plan and where people are, and especially the techniques part of it, that sometimes tools can be distracting for salespeople and they're a really good face-to-face person. And so I don't want to say, hey, Brian, you've been in the business a long time. You're a super networker. Why don't I take you off and have you do cold emails? And because that's what our plan is. And then somebody else that's new, they don't have a network set up. You'd be like, you better make some cold calls and some cold emails or work LinkedIn because you have to build up your contacts. I think those behaviors change and techniques change a little bit based on the role. Is that fair?
Right. No, they change based on the human, really. I mean, here's a good example. So you'll have a person who's a really high disc DC or CD, and they can put together a very complex plan that involves, uploading a bunch of contacts from Zoom Info and, doing an email campaign and then tracking the clicks from the email campaign and then calling the top clickers and following up the phone call with an email and then a LinkedIn message and maybe even doing a second round and a third round of that. And they'll come out with a certain number of results that they can track and do the math on and get it tighter and tighter and perfect it. And then you can have somebody who's a really high DI or something like that, or just a pure I that says, hey, boss, you know what? I'm heading out for cold calls, and then you just go knock on doors, talk to people, make connections, maybe go to networking events. And these two people with two completely different plans can land at the same number of conversations, the same number of prospects, same number of proposals, and same number of closed deals. And so as a leader, again, and we all bring our own disc styles, personalities into leadership too. And we got promoted generally from sales, so we had our own way of doing it. So it's hard for us to not say, hey, this is how you need to do it. But it's better to let people present their own plan based on their own skills, their own personalities, so long as we are measuring things, right? Hence the title of this podcast, and managing things, making adjustments along the way so that we as leaders stay on track with our targets.
There you go. I think we nailed it there. What I'm hearing is we have these non-optional things like setting your goals, hitting your quota. Those are not optional. Using the CRM, whatever it is to make your numbers, not optional. How you do that is your own personal behavioral plan. And that's about you as a manager, getting to know your team, getting to know their assets and their situation to create what that plan is. And I love what you said, because I've seen it so much in people is some people, you send them out and they'll be out on the golf course, they'll be at dinners, they'll be at other things, and they're hitting their numbers. and other people, and you have to tell them like, hey, you have to block out time to enter all of that into the CRM. So we know what the heck you did all day because you were out there, mixing it up and shaking hands and kissing babies. And that's great. We love that you have that skill set. Other sides on the C, they'll be researching and be like, hey, we've done 10 hours of research. It's time to pick up the phone and call somebody.
True.
And I'm going to coach and help you manage your own productivity.
Right.
By helping you shore up and manage your strengths and your weaknesses. And that's a great lesson for a takeaway today. So I want to ask you a couple more about you, Brian, and then we'll wrap up here. What about you? What's the goal you're working on now, or what you feel like is one of your maybe key performance indicators, something that you're measuring?
Oh boy, for me, well, I'll tell you what, we are getting into, for me, our business doesn't really need to be seasonal. It isn't usually that seasonal, but it certainly seems that way right now. We're getting into a really busy season. And for me, I've got to stay very disciplined with following up on all of my prospects. So I block 1 day a week where I really, I'll have other appointments that kind of bleed into that day. But the day is entirely spent, and it's tomorrow following up on prospects via phone, LinkedIn, and email. And I'm looking forward to it, actually, because it always produces money. It produces revenue for sure.
That's great. And do you have a favorite Sandler rule quote or motto to remember here about measuring and managing?
Well, I'll tell you what, I like the one for this topic that says, decide what you want, build a plan, and you can bet on the outcome.
There you go. Great Sandler rule. And we have some new ones out in a new book as well. So if you want to check out how to sell to the modern buyer, that's another thing you can do to take action on what you heard today. Also, don't forget to reach out to your local Sandler trainer to get some help. If you need one, go to Sandler.com, click on find a training location. You can also ask them about the HubSpot CRM if you don't have one. We are resellers there as well. And you can always give us a review, a couple of thumbs up for the podcast, share this with somebody that you think needs to hear it. And until next time, whatever you are, be a good one. The How to Succeed podcast is brought to you by Sandler, the worldwide leader in sales management and customer service training with over 200 locations. More information at Sandler.com. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to click subscribe to get notified about future sales and leadership videos from Sandler.
The Sandler Summit returns in 2023. Each new event builds exponentially upon the energy and success of the prior year. The 2022 Sandler Summit event was a huge success for everyone who attended, so don't miss the next one. Buy your tickets to the Sandler Summit at Sandler.com/summit.